Now, the reasons why these three imperatives are crucial, why I identify them as crucial in the realm of normative political and social theory is because most forms of social critique today crystallize around one of them, around either one of them. But there are some exceptions, and these are the forms of social critique which I call holistic social critique, which try to synthesize and harmonize these three imperatives of justification. But let me first mention what these three imperatives are. So first, there is what I call proceduralist political philosophical social critique, which focuses on satisfying the imperative of normative universalism. And it's characterized by the ontological approach to the grounding of critique, which should safeguard the universal normative validity of its critical claims. Now, most of contemporary critical theory, I would argue, belongs to this type of critique, so proceduralist political philosophical, which tries to further elaborate certain insights of the original critical theory which relate to a universalist theory of justice. So contemporary critical theorists like Sheila Ben Habib, Rainer Forst, Maeve Cook, for example, all continue a line of work of Jürgen Habermas, which is primarily devoted to articulating as encompassing as universal as possible transcontextual criteria for justifying normative claims. And then they kind of sideline what you could call the social theoretical aspect of critical theory, which is based on anchoring social critique in explanatory propositions about social reality, anchoring them in what we might call causal explanations of forms of social injustice and domination. Now, the reason why they sideline this line of work within critical theory is its problematic, the problematic status of its normative claims in terms of universality and epistemological anti-authoritarianism. Any kind of causal explanation of social injustices and forms of domination requires certain substantive arguments, ontological arguments, what the social reality is composed of, substantive arguments that relate to a theory of the subject, what human beings are essentially, and so forth. And these kind of claims are very hard to reconcile with any imperative of universality or epistemological anti-authoritarianism. That's why there is a second strand within contemporary realm of social critique, which I call contextualist forms of critique, and which encompasses different currents actually that are not so close to each other. For example, communitarianism in political philosophy, pragmatism as one of the major contemporary epistemological orientations and orientations within political philosophy as well, and the so-called sociology of critique of Luc Boltanski, for example, in the realm of social theory. So a kind of social theory which does not try to give an independent normative account of injustices, but tries to reconstruct the social actors' own perspectives. So what is common to these different currents of thought, in my opinion, what makes them all contextualist is their devotion to satisfying the imperative of epistemological anti-authoritarianism, which means that the contextualist theorists believe that both the universalist theorists of justice and what I call the radical diagnostic kind of social critique, so the radical diagnosticians, they both require that we, ordinary social actors, endorse their normative perspective on reality as the only right or true one. And this is fundamentally problematic for the contextualists. So they refrain from any kind of substantive normative speculation, and they locate the criteria of critique in the empirically existing and then theoretically reconstructed discourses of justification. And then there is what I call the third, the diagnostic current within contemporary social critique, which brings to mind currents like neo-Marxism, critique inspired by the work of Michel Foucault, for example, or Lacanian and Freudian psychoanalysis, etc. So this approach to critique is based on a high degree of speculation regarding the nature of the human subject and the ontology of the social, and it tends to focus on what you might call the deep-lying dynamics of social domination, which operate at the level of human subjectivation, which means the socially conditioned self-formation. And they're not very concerned with these issues of normative universalism or epistemological anti-authoritarianism. They consider this a waste of time. They want to go straight to the matter, to the pressing issues of injustice and domination in the real world. However, these perspectives, what they lack is a sensitivity to these issues of normative universalism and the kind of authoritarian violence that they can do to ordinary actors' perspectives and worldviews. And I believe that these questions cannot so easily be neglected and sidelined today, especially also for political purposes. It's very easy for different kinds of political liberalism then to just delegitimize radical substantivist diagnostic standpoints on social reality as just particularistic and authoritarian. Now, holistic social critique, as I mentioned before, tries to overcome these divisions, tries to reconcile these different imperatives. And I'd just like to briefly mention two authors, Jürgen Habermas and Axel Honneth, that belong to the second and third generation of critical theory. And what characterizes their perspectives, which are related but also fundamentally different, is this, I'd say, is this kind of ambition to simultaneously pursue these three imperatives of justification at the same time, and this creates huge tensions and problems within their perspectives, within all three dimensions. So in Habermas's perspective, there's a big tension between, on the one side, his discourse ethics, his very refined attempts at developing a very nuanced and very universalist kind of normative foundation of critique in the form of discourse ethics, and on the other side, his attempt to articulate a critique of social pathologies, for example, in the form of the concept of the systemic colonization of the life world. It's very hard to reconcile these, because the second one is premised upon certain very substantive arguments about what social reality consists of. Two different forms of action, integration, communicative reason, and functional or systemic reason. These are already very speculative claims that can't easily be kind of universally obligatory for any social actor. And then there is Axel Honneth, who tries to keep this huge ambition of Habermas, is to keep all the three imperatives of justification within his perspective, but tries to become more substantive, tries to introduce a social ontology, which Habermas is hesitant to do, tries to introduce much more substantive arguments about the theory of the subject and so forth. This once again creates a huge tension between what he calls the universal normative validity of his perspective, his presumed normative universalism on the one hand, and his very substantive diagnostic attempts on the other side. Now, my main argument in the paper is that we can find within the realm of political action a similar kind of tension in a special kind of political movements that I call collective social engagement, which differs from what you usually consider to be political protest, conventional political protest. Collective social engagement is a kind of political action which aims at transforming a certain phenomenon into a political phenomenon, a phenomenon that had hitherto not been considered political by the general public. And my example in the paper is the case of the Belgrade waterfront project. I'm not sure if most of the people from Serbia would be familiar with it, but it's a grand-scale project of urban development anchored in a broader neoliberal agenda of the current government in Serbia, a very dubious affair which involves some partners from the United Arab Emirates, and the plan is basically to redevelop a whole area alongside the River Sava in central Belgrade into some kind of into a business district and also residential, very upscale residential neighborhood, which completely neglects the public interest, goes against the public interest of the citizenry, involves authoritarian behavior of the government, total arbitrariness, the changing of existing laws without the consultation of the public. So it involves a whole array of issues which relate to the democratic legitimacy and public good. And what I argue is that basically the whole issue of the Belgrade waterfront was at first treated as non-political by the general public. The general public was apathetic. It kind of, at least passively, tacitly endorsed the government's position that it is a purely non-ideological project of urban renewal and development, progress, etc., etc. So, in order to politicize this phenomenon, the famous initiative, We Won't Let Belgrade Drown, a wordplay, employs three vocabularies of critique. So I'm running out of time, so I'll try to just summarize this in 2 minutes. Basically, what I argue is that you can, if you conduct a very, very superficial discourse analysis of the movement's discourse, of the movement's vocabulary, you will find three types of vocabulary within the movement, which correspond to the three forms of social critique and the three imperatives of justification in the realm of theory. So this is the language of universalism, normative universalism, the language of contextualism, and the language of diagnosis, which I have identified in the movement's bulletin. We won't let Belgrade drown. I focus on particular statements which exemplify the three vocabularies, and I try to argue that the fundamental tension that we have previously identified in the realm of theory resurfaces in the realm of political action in a different form. Namely, there is a fundamental tension between the movement's attempt to criticize the Belgrade waterfront project from a position of normative universalism, from a position of transcending the existing institutional order of Serbia, the emerging neoliberal order, and also from a position of a radical diagnosis of the existing forms of social domination which underpin the project of Belgrade waterfront and which are exemplified by this project on the one hand, and an attempt to also criticize the whole project immanently from the perspective of the institutional order itself in order to legitimize its own position. So there is a huge tension between the languages of normative universalism and diagnosis, which also involve some forms of neo-Marxist discourse on the one hand, and the language of legality and drawing upon the existing laws to criticize the project as authoritarian and arbitrary. And that's where I find the moment of institutions. So because the movement wants to institutionalize itself, to institutionalize its position, its normative standpoint, it wants to anchor itself within the existing institutional world on the one hand, and it wants to transcend it on the other hand, and this creates a confusion, and it threatens to delegitimize the movement a little bit, in my opinion. It would do best to abandon the whole idea of legality and the contextualist vocabulary, but in my opinion, but then it would also kind of be a much more difficult struggle to assert itself in the public sphere. And I think that this example is kind of characteristic of the whole conception of collective social engagement as a novel form of political agency which tries to politicize a certain phenomenon. So I've run out of time. I'm sorry, I'm open to questions in discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. We will have a discussion after the presentation later.
Okay, so I'm pleased to see you all. Okay, my contribution for this special issue was named Pragmatic Epistemology and the Community of Engaged Actors. And I'm going to try to be brief, but I'm not sure that I'm going to be. And I'm going to be boring, that's for sure, because I'm going to read. So, it goes without saying that the idea of social engagement is problematic, but also has many potentials. And this is what we tried to do in this special issue, to reflect. We tried from various discourses, various disciplines, to reflect and to show how this notion is complex and in which way in which are its potentials. And we can say, for instance, that even a superficial theoretical insight into social engagement should somehow explain the fact that as an engaged social group, we act upon concrete social practices with the idea of radically changing our social environment. But on the other hand, in order to act as an organized social group, we also need to rely on various kinds of social conventions. Promises must be kept. We perhaps need technology to communicate efficiently, and so on. In that sense, one could say that social engagement potentially disrupts changes of some social relationships only if it maintains others successfully. The importance of stable, in other words, institutionalized conventions also has some epistemological implication, and this is the main topic of my paper. Namely, one could maintain that scientific method of social sciences is a specific type of convention which gives the social scientist a reliable knowledge about what is to be done in a given situation. Here we run into a couple of important questions. Namely, we can claim that within a group of socially engaged individuals, the status of those individuals who are familiar with a specific scientific method is epistemologically privileged. And also, we can ask ourselves whether this kind of social engagement that advocates relatively radical social change must involve this kind of entitlement, this kind of epistemological entitlement. And this is I will present now a brief sketch of an argument how a pragmatical insight into this kind of issues could be useful, although I'm not sure. So when someone is getting involved with some specific social problem, we tend to suppose that she or he must have some sort of competence, some sort of deeper insight into the issue at hand. It seems perfectly reasonable to think that in order to change a specific part of reality, we first need to properly know various aspects of our environment. It might also be perfectly reasonable to look for the knowledge needed for our engagement among the theories that are taught at social sciences departments. However, even if we agree with this positivistic outlook, it would be difficult to deny the fact that social action and social change also tend to have a sporadic and a contingent character. In that sense, we could cynically say that there hasn't been a modern revolution or crisis that didn't take the majority of social scientists almost completely by surprise. Therefore, in spite of the general popularity of the idea that we must have a proper scientific knowledge if we are to be certain that specific kind of social change will occur, it also seems reasonable that we somehow take into account the contingency of collective action. This approach is not compatible with any kind of algorithmic thinking about social reality, in a sense, input-output, yeah? Input, method, output. It seems that as soon as we try to frame the epistemological nature of engagement, we immediately face the question whether the knowledge produced by social sciences is capable of inducing social change. The idea that social sciences could somehow foster knowledge that brings real, palpable social change becomes less intuitive if we take into account the history of social sciences. Namely, the advent of the French Revolution played a crucial role in the formation of science of men. Some intellectuals took this major event and the tide of social change that followed as a beacon of hope, while for others it became synonymous with a great danger of the future. Nonetheless, for all classics of social sciences, the revolution had an unbearable element of surprise. This was taken as an argument that conventional philosophy was not up to the task of explaining social problems. Hence, this new kind of thinkers claimed that in order to make the behavior of man, which is a term that this is used by Charles Fourier, that in order to make more predictable claims about the behavior of man, we first need to embrace a new kind of scientific methodology. In this regard, the so-called utopian socialists are very illustrative. So, for instance, in already mentioned Charles Fourier, we found an almost vehement accusation of traditional philosophy. So, in a paper called Civilized Philosophy, he says, "What is the error committed by the philosophers? What branch of learning have they failed to investigate? There are several, and notably the branch with which they claim to have been particularly concerned, I mean the study of man. Although they claim to have exhausted the subject, they know absolutely nothing about it." The main goal of Fourier's attack is to point out how old philosophy is plagued with uncertainty, and that if we wish to move away from the gradual reform and leap in moral and political thinking, a precise method of calculating destiny is more than necessary. So, he says, so long as the human mind has not discovered the calculus of social destinies, we must remain in a state of political cretinism. Our progress in a few of the natural sciences is useless, for it has not provided us with a remedy for any of man's ills. The accomplishments of these scientists only serves to emphasize the confusion of social thought, which has done nothing to promote human happiness, and which, after 30 centuries of correctiveness and reforms, has left all social evils as deeply rooted as ever. So, according to Fourier, 3,000 years of metaphysical philosophy has amounted to nothing more than a confusion which was useless in face of real problems, problems that evidently demand our scientific engagement if we wish to avoid being political cretins who just found themselves one day in the midst of the revolution. Saint-Simon has a similar argument, but he says that in a time of grave danger and when we have for instance, wars, revolutionary and Napoleonic wars, when Europe is slaying itself, there is a much greater need for scientific method because, as he says, it can reconcile people's interests. It can level them up. So one of the stories that every freshman in social sciences learn during his first lesson is the social sciences seek to know the relations between groups and individuals only for the sake of the knowledge itself. Evidently, this was not the case for the early pioneers such as Fourier and Saint-Simon, since they thought that social sciences were primarily the means for taming social change through the use of rational, calculable methods. It is therefore important to understand that it was precisely this political and moral promise of predictable change, rather than the development of some reliable method which produced the privileged epistemological position for the social scientist as a new form of intellectual avant-garde. But this discovery of precise scientific method of governing our public action had one more interesting consequence. The projections of future made by this new class of avant-garde intellectuals was not just wishful thinking, since there was finally a method of settling debates, reconciling people's interests, as Saint-Simon calls it, about different goals and different practical actions for achieving them. In that sense, the deepest private desires could be translated into public values, and all of this was done in the name of objective scientific progress. One could therefore argue that the early social sciences bore the mark of the 19th century because this type of understanding social change, where the private desires must shape the public in a very, it's in a sense very compatible with the romantic imperative of political imagination and self-creation. Now, of course, it is quite easy to highlight the shortcomings of this and naivety of this approach, which was first formulated by early pioneers. But even the real classics, such as Durkheim, Marx, Todd, Levi-Strauss, and others, who developed theoretical system which, if anything, showed how difficult it was to develop calculus of destinies, also shared some of the premises found in the early works, as I said. So I'm now going to skip because I'm running out of time. Okay, yeah, but this isn't important. I mean, the basic premise is that we have at our disposal a way of discovering truth, and that this method opens up a possibility to project our private desires onto the public sphere. And now I'm going to just shortly say something about pragmatism, and I'm just going to skip right away to John Dewey, because I'm going to just for a short while going to say something which I think is important, why pragmatism is in a way different from some other ways of critiquing this kind of approach. I mean, pragmatists remain critical of any aspiration of God's view, which was developed in a sense by Fourier and other classics of social sciences. But unlike the aforementioned, unlike other forms of critique, for instance, made by Foucault or Kuhn or Goffman or Latour, pragmatists believe the social scientists, if they focus on social issues, could still, together with public, generate social change that could create a more just world. In that sense, they were more, let's say, hopeful, and at the same time, they remained critical against this kind of idea of metaphysical violence that was introduced first by the early pioneers. And this is perhaps most vivid in John Dewey's work, who took the most radical step in positioning pragmatism in a wider historical context. Namely, for Dewey, the emergence of the scientific method was not an important event in the history of ideas, but also an event with a far-reaching social and political implication. The biggest innovation that the modern science brought was the practice of experiment, which according to Dewey blurred the distinction between theory and practice. For instance, he summarized this position in his book called Quest for Certainty, where he says, science is interested in the mechanism of occurrences instead in final causes. In dealing with the proximate instead of with the ultimate, knowledge deals with the world in which we live, the world which is experienced instead of attempting through the intellect to escape to a higher realm. Experimental knowledge is a mode of doing, and like all doing, it takes place at a time, in a place, and under specifiable conditions. Dewey's account of knowledge as a form of action entails that science, and especially social science, this enrichment can only be attained through a community that values communication, through a community which is not on the lookout for the ultimate realm and is not interested in calculating anything like destinies of people, and is rather more focused on open-ended experimental mode of self-reflexivity. Therefore, in reconstruction and philosophy, Dewey claims that investigation has become a dominant life occupation for some persons, but these persons represent a social division of labor, and their specialization can be trusted only when such persons are in unobstructed cooperation with other social occupations, sensitive to other people's problems and transmitting result to them in a wider application in action. As we can see, for Dewey, there is something untrustworthy and treacherous in the ideal of the socially aloof scientist, since, according to him, the sensitivities to the needs of others is the only way to guarantee an objective inquiry. This means that in Dewey's pragmatism, the role of the public is not a passive one. Unlike Fourier and Saint-Simon, pragmatists maintain that social science cannot project anymore his or her private desires onto the public simply because in his or her engagement they follow some methodological procedures. In Deweyan terms, the point is rather to use scientific methodology with the purpose of making our collective desires more intelligent. In that sense, we might say that pragmatists drop the idea of the scientist who always engages his environment as an individual and argue instead for engagement that can only be attained collectively. And instead of conclusion, I'm going to end this with just few short notes about relativism. As soon as we start speaking about pragmatism, claiming that community plays a key role in the formation of any kind of epistemic insight, we can expect the unavoidable accusation of relativism. After all, the somewhat dominant view holds that objectivity is attained in a purely abstract manner. Therefore, we can say that pragmatic epistemology, some might say that pragmatic epistemology negates objectivity as the key notion of modern science. Given the scope of this paper, I won't delve now into the never-ending debate about relativism, but I think it is still important to stress that pragmatic conceptualization of the community does not present a real threat to objective truth. Namely, according to pragmatists, objective truth cannot be derived from some eternal faculty or principle that we as humans have in our possession, but is rather a product of communication and debate about a concrete problem. In other words, pragmatists think that objectivity is communally generated practice of investigation which is inherently susceptible to change. And the collective, we can now see that, that if we follow the cues of contemporary pragmatists such as Kuhn and Feyerabend, when it comes to changing objectivity valid truth, the change may occur in two different ways. The first way is the more conventional one, in which in our research practice we encounter a particular problem that could be resolved under current state of scientific vocabularies as that we as a community of peers have at our disposal. In other words, in this case, we can, at best, only slightly modify our scientific vocabularies. However, other type of problems are so disruptive that they cannot be resolved easily using any kind of current vocabularies, and in order to resolve them, we must invent meanings. And I'm going to end on this short note, that when we invent these new institutions, there cannot be any kind, because of all previously said, there cannot be any kind of algorithm that is that guarantees that when we have a particular type of input, that we must have a particular type of output. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Srdjan. Okay, so in order to be, we have some time limitations, and because I want to be brief and concise, I've decided to organize my presentation in the following way. Firstly, I will say a couple of things about solidarity and citizenship, two key notions of my presentation. I will just very briefly go through them and maybe explain why I find that institutionalizing solidarity, in my mind, tantamounts to anchoring it in citizenship. And then I will conclude with 3 hypotheses on which we can have a discussion later on during the period designated for discussion. So, solidarity has become something of a buzzword today. Everybody's talking about it, and this is primarily because of the context of multiple crises in which we are living, primarily economic and refugee crises. So we can see that media, and especially social networks, are flooded with stories about citizens, ordinary citizens, organizing ad hoc and displaying tremendous acts of solidarity towards those in need. And maybe you recall articles from Guardian and many other news outlets about ad hoc organized public kitchens or legal aid offices or medical aid clinics that were self-organized by citizens who voluntarily invested their time and their own resources to help others. And these acts were praised not only as acts of compassion towards others, as acts of solidarity, but they also were used to criticize the lack of response from the state and international institutions. But what caught my interest is that in many reflections on these acts of solidarity, we could find something of a using solidarity as a model for prefigurative thinking and contemplation about new possibilities for alternatively organize our economic, social, and political worlds, where solidarity is now invoked as a principle on which we could, for instance, organize our economic world instead of on growth, or solidarity should be a model that could somehow help us think beyond present capitalist and liberal representative modes of governing. So in other words, these examples are kind of using solidarity as a political tool. So my very general intention, my very general interest is in this political operationability of solidarity. Is solidarity a political concept? What does it mean to base a political community on the principles of solidarity? What would that practically mean? Can solidarity be used not only to help and support others, but also to challenge existing political orders or to establish new ones? In other words, can solidarity really be political? So these are the initial questions that I was looking at and I'm still looking at. And then I wanted to begin my, my inquiries into the political operationability of solidarity by connecting it with the notion of citizenship, by exploring the relationship between solidarity and citizenship. Now, why? Firstly, because if we want to think about political usefulness or values of solidarity, we also need to connect it with some other notions and other concepts that capture within themselves ideas, ideals, and norms of political functionings of communities. And without a doubt, citizenship is one such notion. We cannot. There is no debate of political community without debate, significant debates on citizenship. Secondly, there is hardly a theory and a model of citizenship. There cannot be found a theory or a model of citizenship that does not presuppose some elements of solidarity as foundational. So you can see in various histories of the theories of citizenship and various theoretical models of citizenship how one or another form of solidarity is there and is essential. What is important is that it's very rarely thematized as such, but it is always there. For instance, in his historical overview of the development of national citizenship, Roger Brubaker, when he explores and compares the models of French and German citizenship models as two ideal models, he always underlines this idea of solidarity between co-nationals under the same state institutions. So this is the solidarity that exists in the national model of citizenship. Or for instance, in the social variant of citizenship, when we think about social citizenship, that is social rights, rights to healthcare, to free education, and to other social services, the underlying idea behind social citizenship is solidarity with the less fortunate co-citizens, or transgenerational solidarity, for instance, for pension funds. Or if we think about multicultural citizenship as developed either in variants of group differentiated citizenship by Iris Marion Young, or multicultural citizenship by Will Kinlick, or many others, either liberal or communitarian political philosophers, there's always the accent is on solidarity among specific ethnic, religious, linguistic, sexual, and other groups that is kind of important to take into account for these differentiated citizenship models. So, in other words, solidarity is very important because it's always there in theories of citizenship, although, as I said, very rarely thematized as such. And finally, another reason why I think it is important to relate solidarity to citizenship is because even though citizenship owes conceptually very much to solidarity, the two notions they are in tension, and they form a paradoxical duo, because citizenship is a peculiar notion that simultaneously incorporates inclusion and exclusion. So there's always, if you have citizenship, you always have some sort of boundaries, most often nation state, but not exclusively, boundaries encircling the body of citizens, and there are non-citizens outside these boundaries, whereas solidarity loses much of its meanings when expected to operate within certain imposed limits, especially if these limits are geographical, as it is usually the case with citizenship. So they are in some kind of tension. This tension, this paradoxical relationship, this paradoxical alliance between solidarity and citizenship was also something that I am very interested in. But anyway, these are the reasons why I wanted to look at the two notions. Now, as for solidarity as a political, as I said, solidarity is, relating solidarity to political community is nothing new. There is always in the history of political thought, solidarity is very often described as this social glue that turns individuals into members of society. But it is very rarely thematized as such. It's very rarely systematically thematized, let alone thematized as a political force. And it is almost always assumed as already existing, or as something that just happens between actors who are alike, or who strive to achieve the same goal, as in, for instance, there comes mechanical and organic solidarity, or is in rational choice theory, where solidarity is something that emerges from cooperative behavior. It is in the essence of cooperative behavior, but it is very rarely thematized as something that can be forged, something that can be built and then used to maintain and to build a specific kind of political community. Also, we don't have that many politically useful, so to speak, definitions of solidarity. And usually when one defines solidarity, it is almost always through differentiation from other notions. So for instance, Hannah Arendt in her book on revolution, she claimed certain political value in solidarity, and she differentiated, she described solidarity as something different from pity and from compassion, and I will quote her. She says, it is out of pity that men are attracted toward les hommes faibles, but it is out of solidarity that they establish deliberately and as it were dispassionately a community of interest with the oppressed and exploited. For solidarity, because it partakes of reason, and hence of generality, is able to comprehend a multitude conceptually, not only the multitude of a class or a nation or a people, but eventually all mankind. Recently I stumbled upon an edited volume called Solidarity Theory in Practice. It is a rather new one from 2014, and the authors, the editors, Lehtinen and Pessi, I hope I'm pronouncing Lehtinen correctly, I don't know. They also try to define solidarity through differentiation, through distinction from other similar notions. So they say not all pro-social feelings qualify as solidarity, and then I quote them, as solidarity is often based on we thinking, it can be separated not only from anti-social egocentrism, but also from one-sided docentrism such as altruism, sympathy, caring, or Christian charity. While these concentrate on the well-being of the other or you, the target of concern in solidarity can be us together. So even though I did not know about these authors, I myself in the paper that is the basis of this presentation had a similar attempt at defining solidarity. It follows the path of Lehtinen and Pessi. I was trying to further elaborate Hannah Arendt's notions, because she was trying to say how solidarity was different from affections. It is a different type of affection, and I wanted to underline that it's not just the nature of affection and action that sets solidarity apart from other empathic impulses, but also the nature of the relationships it builds. And then I wanted to differentiate solidarity from charity, because I found that one of the defining traits of solidarity is an implicit leveling that occurs between the parties involved. And this is where the difference between charity and solidarity resides, namely in the principle of equality, because charity does not imply a critique of existing hierarchies. It merely prescribes the desirable moral conduct for those on top of the social and economic ladder. Solidarity, on the other hand, emerges from situations in which people recognize each other as equal and thus entitled to the same rights and living conditions. We act in solidarity when we want to alleviate some sort of injustice or respond to its consequences, whether man or nature-made. Hence, the social values underlying solidarity are equality and justice, mutually intertwined, as the just order is seen in this respect as the order of equality. When it comes to social values embodied in solidarity, I would just like to add that besides equality and justice, another important social value is also communality, because I also think that solidarity is defined as an act when we simultaneously give something and give up on something. And to be in solidarity with thus implies the sharing of a position or experience with those who neither seek solidarity nor partake in their situation. So this also means that acts of solidarity do not necessarily have to be acts at all in the sense of agency, because sometimes it is with inaction, with a refusal to act, or with self-censorship that we show our solidarity. Solidarity thus imposes limits on our individual agency and to individualism in general, stressing the higher importance of a group cause or principle we share with others. In other words, some sort of communalism is always implied in solidarity. Therefore, having in mind these three social values and what I've said previously about the relationship between solidarity and citizenship, here are very shortly, very briefly, these three hypotheses. First one, even though historical struggles for equal rights brought solidarity and citizenship conceptually close to each other, the two notions remain incommensurable, given the fact that citizenship is a simultaneously inclusive and exclusive notion, incorporating the idea that some sort of boundaries encircles the body of citizens. Hypothesis number 2, the evolution of citizenship has had an almost asymptotic relationship with equality, striving to attain it as a proper constitutive ideal, but constantly reproducing internal hierarchies and classes of not so equal citizens. And this is becoming even more prominent today with growing gaps between haves and have-nots, and with discriminatory measures against immigrants and refugees. The two trends representing simultaneously demise of welfare state and rise of identity politics. Solidarity thus produces tensions with citizenship regarding failures to accommodate the equality of the statuses, rights and identities of all citizens. And finally, the third hypothesis is that the models of global citizenship, as argued there are many examples of it. For instance, I was referring to ecological citizenship and models of cosmopolitan citizenship. They transcended the tension between citizenship and solidarity, as they rely both on institutional solutions and on international solidarity of all citizens, but do not envision political community regarding the body of citizens, and support equality and justice in a very restricting manner, thus invoking only thin variants of both concepts. That is all. Thank you.
Okay, so I know we're all tired, and I just want to surprise you and say that I've cut my paper down to 3 pages with large fonts, so you can rest at ease. So my topic is activism, and I actually don't, when we were making this conceptual journal dedicated to social engagement studies, I thought that I don't have a topic to write on, because it's not my topic. So I wanted to somehow remain true to the object and of research, and perhaps go more into the history of activism. So we're all talking about activism, but who were the first activists? So when did the first activists emerge? And obviously we have the student activism, left-wing, right-wing activism, civil rights activism, the political activists, and even Horkheimer and Adorno wrote on fascist activism. So these are all unusual terms in the sense that they concealed, thank you, that they concealed much more than they revealed. And it says, if their content becomes totally irrelevant before generic activity, and even if it serves to underline the role of the actors themselves. So an activist's cause can be anything from fascism to civil rights and beyond. Hence, it's trans-ideological acceptance. So if we ask who were the first activists, I actually stumbled on a small history of activism. So according to Astra Taylor, who was an activist herself from the Occupy Wall Street movement, there is an unclear genealogy of activism which goes as follows. So unlike the term organizer, I quote, with its relation to its clear roots in trade union and labor politics, activist has murky origins. So associated early on with German idealist philosopher Rudolf Eucken, who believed that striving is necessary to a spiritual life, it was then sometimes used to describe outspoken supporters of the Central Powers during the First World War. And also I saw that in Oxford Dictionary, it says that those arguing against neutrality to war were called the activists in Sweden. And in a sense, if we ask this question, who were the first activists, the answer would be warmongering Swedes. So those who were for war. And eventually, this term came to signify political action more broadly. It proliferated in the politics of identity in the 60s and the 70s, and of course, unlike abolitionists, populists, suffragette, unionists, and socialists, which all convey a clear position on an issue, activism, by proliferation during the 70s, became a generic political category. And this is actually and this is a second point in the history of activism. This is why the first reaction to the activism came from 20th century Marxism and communist political figures who emphasized organization over activism. For example, I saw that Amadeo Bordiga, the founder of the Communist Party of Italy, called activism an illness of the working class movement, which requires continuous treatment. And the French Organisation des Jeunes Travailleurs Révolutionnaires, the organization of the young revolutionary workers, inspired by the Situationist International, in 1972 published the study Le militantisme état suprême de l'aliénation, which translates into activism being the highest stage of alienation. So And this is very interesting. And also Theodor Adorno, who famously opposed student movements, criticized activism for what he calls actionism, which attempts, I quote, to rescue enclaves of immediacy in a fully mediated society, on his essay on resignation. So in this sense, the critical reactions toward activism point exactly to these shifts in meaning. So from the reduction of the immediate to immediate, of the organized to spontaneous and generic, of the universal to particular, and so on. So this is, of course, a very problematic thing if you want to investigate what activism is. But as far as I see it, even in its reductive capacity, it has always presupposed a certain content in which one is active. So we have a cause, a call as in a call to action, and also what is often, I think, forgotten is that there is always this background of a nation state, of a governing body which is unable to deal with the social contradictions of its own. And this dimension of activism, I would argue, is what I want to investigate, would be the place to search where these enclaves of immediacy between governing body and subjects of resistance occur. So this is when Jelena, my colleague, turned my attention to Isin Engin, who has a conception of activist citizenship, which I want to present and investigate now. So what Isin means by activist citizenship can best be seen on the example of the sans-papiers in France, who, despite being illegalized and undergoing police roundups with no legal recognition, were able to in fact influence the state and to alter its citizenship to accept their role in French society. So because of this, Etienne Balibar described as, I quote, privileged moments in the development of active citizenship or direct participation in public affairs, without which there exists no polity, but only a state form cut off from society and petrified in its own abstraction. So, however, although Balibar speaks of them as active citizens, he neglects that the sans-papiers were in no way following the usual lines of active citizenship, but were in fact altering the fiber of citizenship itself. And this is why Isin Engin proposes to distinguish between the active citizen and what he calls activist citizenship. And so, I quote again, by contrast to active citizens who act out already written scripts such as voting, tax paying, and enlisting, activist citizens engage in writing scripts and creating their own game, creating the scene. So, according to him, the actors of citizenship do not have to be the possessors of any tangible citizenship, but can act or perform in the name of citizenship as an instituted subject position, without which it would, be they migrants, refugees, states, courts, and so on, it is irrelevant. So they can act upon this instituted subject position as a subject which holds citizenships and change it in a way with their resistance, to be very simplistic. So the political in this sense is not limited to an already constituted territory or its legal subject, but always exceeds them. So instead of focusing on already constituted actors, we need to take into account these transformations that they're making citizenship vivid and not merely an abstract category of state governing. And this is why Isin understands their constitutive role in citizenship as a way of being political. And this is why he speaks of acts of citizenship as acts, I quote again, that transform norms and modes of being political by bridging into being new actors as active citizens through creating or transforming sites and stretching scales of citizenship. So unlike Balibar, who makes no such distinctions, Isin differentiates between these abstract categories of citizenship enforced by the state and acts of citizenship which break them up or reintroduce a caesura in the categories themselves. Okay, so although this line of thought gives some credit to this relation between the governing body and the subjects of resistance, which I mentioned at the beginning, and presents them as more than enclaves of immediacy, there are two problems with it. So, one, in Isin Engin's conception of activist citizenship, it seems that the specificities of different conceptions of citizenship collapse into the myriad acts of being political, which ends up making merely a sort of a continuum of being political. So this is one thing. The second thing is that the cost of this is that we lose sight of some of the pitfalls of the distinctly modern, formal, democratic conception of citizenship. And also, which follows from this, is the fact that some group would have won its right over a constitutive citizenship and transform its content. It does not entail that it's emancipatory for all citizens. So, what I'm aiming at, in fact, is what Domenico Losurdo called the dialectic between emancipation and disemancipation. So, according to him, in the United States, the disappearance of censitary discrimination, which means discrimination by property, is in fact entailed the affirmation of the principle of political equality, which aided in the quantitative containment and political and social neutralization of the dangerous classes, thanks to the expropriation of deportation of Indians, which for a long time made it possible to enlarge the class owners and landowners and the enslavement of blacks. So, yeah. Okay, so one critique of this is that although one group can make an act of citizenship and emancipate themselves, the other group would also be, in a sense, expropriated or exploited. What I would argue against this sort of conception, which argues for a continuum of being political or whatnot, is what Aleksandar would call the two histories of citizenship. So the idea is that there is a total split within the institutionalization of citizenship in liberalism, in the parliamentary democracy. So this made a break with what Aleksandar would call the demotic tradition of citizenship, where there was a peasant citizen, which were equal. And then afterwards you have what is called this formal democratic citizenship, which in fact entails this dialectic of emancipation, disemancipation. In that formal citizenship, one can emancipate without others being also emancipated as well. So this is the problem. Also, what is interesting is that also during the liberal democratic formal citizenship institution of the parliament being introduced, also with the principles of equality, freedom, etc. So in the liberal tradition, in what Aleksandar would call this liberal cesura, there was actually a split within citizenship itself and the moment of its very inception. And I quote from a history of the French Revolution. There was also, as early as October 1979, that there was a bifurcation. There were created active citizens and passive citizens. So I quote, by creating the active and passive citizens, the revolution had already become ambivalent as to who were the people. While the people remained an abstract, remained sovereign, the constituent had deliberately placed all attributes of sovereignty in the hands of active citizens alone. So, who were the active citizens? They were essentially propertied males over 25 who paid their annual taxes and were entitled to vote and stand office, and others could not. So, although this is a far-fetched argument, having in mind Losurdo and Balibar, etc., we could say that this distinction between active and passive citizens could not be realized before the 18th century. So we could not have had activists before the 18th century, and that is why they have become proliferated early on in the 19th and the 20th century. And today, having in mind Losurdo's idea of dialectic and all of this that we said, we can say that to remain ambiguous to this split within citizenship itself, to this split of liberalism itself, entails glossing over to this, to precisely this idea of emancipation, of what liberalism was supposed to promise, an emancipation for all, an equal emancipation. So, what we need then, if we are to criticize activism, it is precisely to criticize this caesura, this split, this failed promise of liberalism. And in the end, if we, as I said, do not acknowledge this bifurcation, we would fail to include what was by rule excluded from it. And that is precisely the promise of social welfare and economic democracy. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to go back to how Adriana introduced me as a friend of the group. And I bring that up not just to waste time, but also because this paper was written, this is going to be a shortened version of the paper you can read, but it was written with someone else who is also not central to the group of social engagement studies, and we were looking onto the group of in social engagement studies with this question of what is this word engagement. So the title we came up with is Engagement and Joint Commitment on the Obligation to Act Together. And our question, the conversations that we had were about the difference between the French engagé and the English engagement, and those two words don't quite, the English is not quite the translation of the French, and then there's this phrase joint commitment that Margaret Gilbert came up with in attempting to translate the word engagé, but there also might be a difference, or perhaps we'd like to introduce a difference between engagement and joint commitment as well, and maybe somewhere where the two words meet, or where they and how they differ, there might be an idea of how a group should act, or how a group can formulate. That's not the right word either. Can make a new kind of obligation. So we begin our paper with this question of what is the difference or compatibility between the two words engagement and commitment, and perhaps the juxtaposing of the two words can produce an interesting idea of what is engagement if we're talking about the group of group for social engagement. I think if we're shortening papers, I'm going to be the king of this. if that's our goal today. And what does it mean to engage? We have this idea of engaging something or engaging someone. To engage could mean to use a verb in the first person plural. Let's talk about social engagement is the imperative. Let us talk about this. I am using a we here instead of an I. I'm going to suppress my own I and say we should talk about the social engagement, and thus I'm engaging in this conversation. The word in a lot of this. The way I relate to this group in a lot of ways, as a lot of you know, is that I'm the language guy of the group. So a lot of the conversation in this paper was about the language, and we're not the only ones who talked about the language. But engagement comes from this word. Engagé comes from this German word vadi, and the Latin to come closer to someone. To engage is to somehow approach someone else. To become closer, but it's also connected to the words in French "mettre en gage," to pledge, to give a pledge to someone. When I say let's talk about a group of social engagement studies, I'm pledging and trying to get you to engaging you in conversation. I'm pledging something and trying to get you to do something as well. Engager, c'est hypothéquer, right? It's to pledge something is to mortgage something as well. There's a relationship there that might also be uneasy. I'm not sure how you feel about your debt to talk to me right now. But so in this engaged action is first of all, it's public, it's announced, I have to say something, it can't be done in silence, and there's a provocative aspect to it. I have to call you to do this. It's a call to others, it can be heard by others, so there's a public, it can't be done in silence, and it's a call to others for this approaching. I can also be engaged, perhaps calling to others and being approaching others, but we can talk about personal commitment, personal engagement. My you know, my public activities of collecting money for a charity, you know, would you please donate some money, or organizing some kind of a shelter for refugees. That's sort of engagement that comes from me. But then we have this other phrase, joint commitment, and where joint commitment and engagement may be, where commitment maybe splits from personal engagement, where engagement can be performed individually. This engagement that transforms it to group agency is perhaps where we move into this phrase joint commitment, and somewhere these terms overlap. Joint commitment, by the way, is a term from Margaret Gilbert, who I mentioned this, that she's the one who translates it, but she uses joint commitment and engagement in the same way. And while we think that personal engaged action, it remains personal, remains something that we do, joint commitment requires a kind of engagement that involves others, perhaps others who are not necessarily in the group for social engagement. So when the group for social engagement organizes a conference, you are all engaged in working on it, but where it turns into joint commitment is when it obligates and calls others who are not members of the group, at least at the beginning, who are in other ways involved, to then join the group. And this is perhaps the difference to how we use joint commitment from Margaret Gilbert. Whereas I'm engaged in caring for my mother, or we're engaged in writing our texts, that's our thing, but it produces no obligation in others, and maybe we'd like to see a joint commitment, something that is done in such a way that it involves bringing other people in. I'm going to stop there, except for perhaps an example of this joint commitment, and come back to Marian's talk about the protests against the events in Belgrade, where there's this activist group that started this. They're very engaged in organizing these protests, and I didn't think I was going to go to this protest until a final moment right before the beginning of the protest, where I felt this obligation. I'm not part of their group, to come in. It ends up being a lovely walk in the park, which is okay for a protest, I suppose. So the joint commitment is the kind of engagement of a group that doesn't leave others indifferent to what's happening. I'll stop there. Very good.